All right, I'm showing here 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get ourselves started. Let me extend a warm welcome to everyone to today's CEO CFO Leadership Institute faculty-led learning event. This is Module 6, the strategic use of data. This will be the 6th of 7 modules that will be considered over the course of the Institute. As you know, my name is Gerard Jolly. I am the Director of Career Advancement Strategies here with NAC. I'm happy bringing this session with you, along with my colleagues Cindy Thomas and Jervine Williams, also with our Training and Technical Assistance division here at NAC, and our facilitator for today's conversation, Jonathan Chapman of Capital Link, who I'll introduce momentarily. Before we get started, we want to just go over a few of the housekeeping items for you. As you know, the duration of this session is about 90 minutes. It includes presentations and Q&A. At any time during the webinar, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, you can unmute your line and speak up, raise your hand using the Zoom hand feature, or post a message in the chat box. Throughout the session today, you'll be engaged, asked to participate, and expected to contribute. These sessions are what you make of them, of course, and so we encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to engage with the facilitator and your peers, both verbally and in the chat box. We'll ask you to begin your engagement right now by letting Jonathan know where you're joining us from today in the chat box. So please introduce yourself and let him know where you're joining us from today in the chat box. This event is being recorded and will be made available in Nautopod in approximately 2 weeks. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get right into this session. Data-supported decision-making is a continuous process of assessing, prioritizing, planning, implementing, evaluating, and reporting. This process is central to the health of your organization, your patient base, and your community. While focusing on data that's likely available to the CEO and the CFO, this session will discuss some of the concerns and approaches in using this data in the health center to best align both staff and programs with the mission and vision of the health center. Our facilitator for our conversation today is Jonathan Chapman. Jonathan is the Chief Project Officer with Capital Link. He's fulfilled that role since 2019 after having rejoined Capital Link in 2015. Jonathan supports the organization's project consultants in capital development, strategic management, and operational analysis with community health centers. He formerly served as Executive Director of the Louisiana Primary Care Association. So I'm sure, Alicia, I know you want to yell out right now or send a shout out. During his tenure there, the Louisiana Primary Care Association established a legislative caucus, implemented an HCCN, initiated an IPA, completed a $110 million FQHC expansion initiative, and purchased a new LPCA facility. In addition to having earned a BA in Marketing and Finance and an MBA, he has completed multiple healthcare executive programs and recently earned a Predictive Analytics certificate through the University of California, Irvine. He's located in Capital Link's Colorado office, and we're pleased to have him with us. Without further ado, please give our attention to Jonathan Chapman.
Great, thanks, Gerard. And certainly, thanks to Gerard and NAC for the opportunity to participate and contribute in the Institute. Having the opportunity to do this for a couple of times now. It's just been a real joy in talking with folks as you either come from other industries or transition in your role with the health centers. We'll talk a little bit about Capital Link and my experience as we go forward, but certainly, as Gerard said, we'll get right to it. I'll start sharing my screen and making sure that I can see the waiting room as well to let people in. Let's see, making sure, and I'm assuming, let's see, thumbs up that you can see my screen. All right, thanks very much. All right. So I am, let's see, yeah, letting some people in the room. I think I can manage that as well. So we'll go ahead and get started today. And, talking a little bit, around the data aspect, the strategic use of data. Certainly you all know that we have more data than we can possibly consume on most of the time, right? So today's presentation is really looking at how to filter some of the data and certainly how to use the data that you have on hand. Again, with my experience and personally my experience with FQHCs, I've been working with the safety net for about 25 years. And when I mean the safety net, my first, I guess, real job was with the Louisiana Department of Health and worked with all the safety net providers doing feasibility studies, business analytics, and things of that nature. So really, it's important to find that information you have on hand to find out what type of decision you're facing and how much of that information might you have already and how much more you might lack. So I know there's quite a bit of information we'll go through today. Again, as Gerard said, there's sessions recorded. The slides will be provided. Some of the resources that we might mention through here, they're certainly available either through the Capital Link website or just by contacting me. There's some scenarios, some worksheets that we'll look at that are not professionally branded, if you can say that. And so I'm happy to share those as appropriate. So as we get started, right, strategic use of data, we are surrounded by data, but starved for insights. There's so many people that, again, looking at everything that you have to face each and every day, how much of this information, how do you collaborate with other departments? And, a lot of the material that you'll see today actually came from talking with a CEO and then having a separate conversation with a CFO or CMO and finding it important for folks, multiple folks, to hear the same thing at the same time to understand context. And so hopefully today is more like an informal presentation or a conversation rather than a lecture. A little bit just briefly about Capital Link for those of you that may not be aware. We're one of HRSA's NTAPs. If you go to the National Resource Center and look up capital planning and financing, there we are, right? That's kind of our, I guess, expertise, or if you will, and I'm always shy about using that word, expertise, but really a resource for you in capital planning and financing. See there, we've got offices across the United States. And this graphic's a little older now. I mean, it's still 25 years plus, but we've now worked with all 50 of the PCAs. So that includes not only every state, but some of our territories as well. So what does Capital Link do, right? I mean, why am I the guy here talking to you about data besides being a data geek myself, right? So Capital Link's job, the way I like to tell health centers, is really to help you make an informed decision. And some of that begins with self-assessment, right? So if we start talking about data, right? So you've got some equations here from easier to harder, right? So A squared plus B squared equals C squared, right? You remember the triangle? I remember like in math, someone explaining, this is how you determine how many shingles you need for a roof. And I was like, okay, I can understand that. Then you've got the quadratic equation, which, and I laugh a little bit at this because I had spent some time not too long ago with my uncle, who's a chemical engineer, and his middle school student or middle school child was asking about some algebra homework. And he said, well, I've got to relearn it before I can teach it, right? So this is one of those things you either use it or lose it. And then all the way to the right, you have E equals MC squared, right? The theory of relativity. Now, each organization has its own personality, whether it's debt averse or rather data analytics, capacity. So really, as we go through this, identifying and assessing what level of risk and what type of information you have internally kind of determines your opportunities and how you go about making these decisions. So what we're trying to do is identify what type of personality or identity your health center has, and then working with that. So today's discussion, again, data continues to influence strategy and vice versa. We'll look at some common FQHC data and metrics, and then using your existing data in scenario planning. So any questions thus far? And I am looking at two screens. I promise I'm paying attention, but I've got the slides on the larger monitor. So I see that a lot of folks put their name and where they're from in the chat. I appreciate that. If you have a question that's more appropriate in the moment, feel free to speak up or get my attention or Gerard's attention. we're happy to stop as appropriately and discuss some of this. So you're probably very familiar with a data-driven organization or even a learning organization. And so you can see on the far left, data resistance, right? And not that I am aware of any health center that I would label as data resistant. Now, a lot of health centers may be data aware, right? This is what we have. What else can we generate? Data guided, to where we all have our UDS, we all have our financial audits, we all have various other reporting for payers, for organizations, dashboards, provider productivity, et cetera. And then the data savvy, right? This is the insight. And this is kind of compared to the wisdom triangle, if you will, where data kind of essentially works its way up to wisdom, or the strategic stage. Rather than reacting to data, using it to inform considerations. And that's what we're going to try and kind of convey throughout the presentation today. So what is being measured, right? There's so much, right? We've got the UDS, certainly we've got the universal language of money. We're looking at various satisfaction surveys or outcomes, and then healthy living, right? The social determinants of health, a lot of value-based initiatives, things of that nature. So talking to, the C-suite, the CFOs and CEOs in the room, all of these, it's really difficult to separate one from the other without acknowledging the ripple and collaboration effect. And for those of you that are about my age, not that I go back all the way to the abacus, but looking at how technology has evolved and continues to evolve, we're looking at remote patient monitoring now, whereas it wasn't that long ago, unless a patient came to you, you didn't know their vital signs. So really the amount of information that we're gathering is really being made capable by advances in technology, right? From the abacus to cloud servers. And so now we're looking at not if I can get the data, it's how soon can I get the data. So we're looking at different ways of measuring all types of aspects. Talking with Gerard before the session started and some of his work around workforce and recruitment and retention, all of those things continue to be measured as well. Okay, there we go. I'm enabling the closed caption. So I'm a little deaf, so I tend to watch people and their lips. So feel free to say, Jonathan, take a deep breath, a glass of water, slow down, anything along that side. Let's go ahead and admit everybody in the waiting room too. I love this multitasking, right? Who else has to multitask during this hour? So how to measure that? So what to measure, right? So if you talk about measuring data, right, we can talk about distance, speed, time, volume, the number. And so there's so many different metrics to measure, but so many different ways, right? You may be out counting patients in the waiting room. You may be looking at online surveys. You may be talking about community assessments. You may be talking about provider information that they gather from a patient. So, having so much data, again, finding those significant drivers in your equation in order to make those relevant decisions. So who's trying to do it all, right? So I just put this list off the top of my head, right? Starting with IPAs and ACOs, EMRs, HCCNs, your HRSA grants, productivity. I mean, the list goes on. And toward the end, what you're trying to do is put this information and to be able to not only understand it, but convey it, right? So I've done other separate presentations around dashboards and visualizations, and you've got some other in-taps like high tech that do this very well. And so all of this information and then trying to convey it to either staff or partners or payers is its own art and science, if you will. So as you're trying to do everything, what we're again trying to do is filter and funnel this data. And so a lot of our presentations with Capital Link, you'll see this funnel image to where we put in so much information at the top. And as it's going through filter, we want to narrow it down, to filter it to what comes out on the other end is just what you're looking for, right? And not a lot of the other filler, if it were. But a lot of times at the beginning of the day or the beginning of the process, you're not really sure which aspect or which data point is the ultimate driver. So when you start defining your health center, I'll say this to every presentation probably I've ever given. Never define your organization or your performance by 1 year or one metric. Again, not being able to separate a lot of this data from one silo or another or one department from another. And certainly as we've seen the last 2 years, if you look at a UDS trend, 2020 and 2021 will always be outliers. Again, just using a personal example, growing up in Louisiana, 2005 and 2006 were always outliers. That's Hurricane Katrina, right? It shifted populations, it shifted outcomes, it shifted expectations, shifted behaviors. And so as we look through this, we expect a lot of things to kind of shift over time. And as we do look at some of the UDS and financial metrics and benchmarks, I'll probably say this again, right? This is what we've seen up to 2019. And now we're seeing, a shift, if you will, and trying to determine, most of the health centers I talked to during COVID, it was one approach of two. One approach was, I can't wait to get back to 2019, right? This isn't the world I want to exist in. The management's tougher. Other organizations are like, well, we've expanded our branding. We've got an opportunity to take on certain aspects of growth, either with the community or additional patients. I'm ready for 2022 so we can reset the benchmarks. So those are two different personalities, just like we talked about risk or the mathematical equations. And neither necessarily are wrong by any means, but again, identifying that and then working within it. And so we are going to start looking at some of the data itself, right? So for those of you that may not have ever seen a performance evaluation profile or a PEP, this is a dashboard of sorts that Capital Link does, both for our capital project clients as well as, in a lot of states, the PCAs or the HCCNs may do this on their state membership's behalf. But what we're looking at here is the number of financial audits over a 4-year trend, the number of UDS reports, and because of our relationship with HRSA, we get a UDS master file, right? So we have all the UDS, and you can see almost all of the financial audits over this 4-year period. And then just for today's conversation, the two comparisons are rural FQHCs for 2020 and what Capital Link refers to the high-performing FQHCs for 2020. And quite simplistically, Capital Link deems a health center high performing if you've met or exceeded all the financial benchmarks or recommendations, as well as being recognized by HRSA as a quality leader. So kind of a balance between finance operations and that clinical aspect. And so, looking at a performance evaluation profile, this is a comparison. This provides a little bit of context, and I'm sure you've got dashboards just like this. And you can see here that the median U.S. health center, as far as patients served, let me see if I can turn on laser pointer. Yeah. So we've got patients served right here up in the top middle, 2020. You can see that in the median, right? And again, not to go into math, but a median simply means that half of the health centers are above that line or half of them below. So a lot of folks are interested in these national medians. But once you get past the curiosity, you really want to make comparisons that are relevant to your organization, whether it be geography or size or services, a couple of different ways we can look at that. But the median health center in the U.S., start to say Louisiana, 12,023 patients. The rural is a little bit smaller, 9,646, and the high-performing median was just over 11,000. So really the high-performing health centers, just looking at the median, it's not necessarily a greater size than the U.S. And then you look at revenues, you're looking at the median revenues as well. And you can see that, the median health center even at a slightly higher revenue than the high-performing. And then you look at visits, full-time equivalents. So when I pull this dashboard up, you have a sense of, okay, we're comparing relevant sizes and relevant services. Even over here on the left, where it looks at the percentage of medical, dental, mental health, substance abuse, and enabling services, very similar, right? So at this point, again, not taking any one number all to itself, we can say we've got some relevant comparisons. So what we wanted to show you here was, here's the operating margin at the medians, right? This is where the difference starts to play out. You've got over here on the right, we'll just walk through one of these to make sure that the data is conveying itself. The U.S. high performing is in the blue. The U.S. rural health centers, the median is at orange. And then the U.S. all, the median is in gray. And then we've got this benchmark right here. So this is a 3% benchmark. Now, anything above that 3%, we would consider good. We know that healthcare margins are razor thin. I saw something the other day that 2021 hospitals were like 1.5% to 2%, the average margin. And then you can see here, this pink color, right, below 1%. So essentially what we're looking at is anything above 3%, you're able to build up reserves over time, whereas less than 1 or even negative, you're actually losing a little money. So you can see here that benchmark at 3, there is a trend there between the rural and the US. And then these high performings are completely higher, right? Well above 10%. So we're saying, why is that different, right? We're comparing relevant sizes. What are they doing different to provide such a higher operating margin? And before I go on, I heard a little talking in the background. Was that a question for me or something else? No? All right. So this graph is a little messier, right? But what I wanted to do was look at operating margin at the percentiles, right? So rather than just look at a median, look at ranges, the 25th, 75th, as well as the median. So the high performing, again, just over 10%, that's that bold blue line. The dotted line, the dotted blue line, is the lower 25%. And this dashed line is the higher 25%. And so you can see there that the range for the high performing health centers is about between 3 and about 16, 17% over this 4-year trend. Comparing that to the median, all health centers, you can see there, again, that median's right there at that 3%. The higher, as you would expect, around 8%. And then down here, down here, we've got the lower 25th percentile of health centers are below 0. So when you hear Jim McCray at some of these conferences say that a quarter of our health centers are losing patients or a quarter of our health centers are losing money, this is where it comes from. Now, every metric has a story, right? I've talked to health centers that said, well, we had a negative operating margin because of a capital project, because of initiatives, or because Medicaid was slow with the wraparound payment. So if it's just one outlier, it's got a story behind it. Hopefully we don't have any health centers that remain below that 0 operating margin, because then that's a very different conversation. And so when we start talking about a data-driven decision, knowing what types of operating margins are out there, what types of practice patterns, and then knowing where your health center is important. And so how do these health centers produce different operating margins? Well, we're a service-related industry, right? We all know that staffing and wages are always going to be a lion's share of our expenses. And so if you look at this, the US high performers, their personnel expense as a percentage of operating revenue is about 66%. Typically what we see here is a reasonable range is between 65 and about 73%. And I know that's a pretty wide range actually, but a lot of it has to deal with your cost of living. As you might imagine, being from Louisiana, I know that there are places in Louisiana where the cost of living isn't as high as, say, San Francisco. And so provider costs, types of services, fringe benefits, insurance, all of that's going to vary a little bit. But you can see here that all 3 of the medians are within this reasonable range. Now, you might imagine that, if you go higher, like it's 74, 75 and higher, that would be a bad thing, right? So that's something of a concern. If your staff costs are that high, what other portion of your operations are suffering? Are compromising in order to pay that staff. Now, a lot of folks would say, well, why is lower bad, right? Anything below like 62 or 60. In those organizations, we tend to see higher turnover, fewer services going to patients. And again, if it's just 1 or 2 years for a specific reason, that's one thing. But if you're able to maintain staffing costs below 60%, and I have seen organizations do this, you just like you're spending too much, you're likely compromising elsewhere. Days cash on hand, right? So all of this is like
Jonathan,
how much? Yes.
I'm sorry, there was a question in the chat for you.
Oh, I'm sorry, I ran right over it, didn't I? What was that?
No worries. It comes from Julia. She asked, does it include revenue adjustments such as 340B, or do you exclude in your definition of operating margin?
Great question. I had a health center. I walked through their own PEP report yesterday, and their staffing cost was relatively low. And we looking at the audit, it's because 30% of their revenue was from 340B, to where it was tremendous revenue without a tremendous staff cost. And so this is based, and I should have said this earlier if I hadn't, this is based entirely off the financial audits and the UDS report. So we know that there is some deviation between how 340B might be incorporated into your audit, but for the most part, it is pretty consistent. So if you have it listed as an operating revenue, we have it listed. And then that would cause probably the staffing to be a little bit lower than someone who was not having a significant 340B revenue. So did I ramble through that well enough, or?
Jonathan, maybe can I ask a little bit? So in that question, I mean, is it just because I know, for in our state that, 340B has changed and there's just all these threats. And so I guess, is it beneficial to do the analysis without it because of the threat, or, and I guess it's a question because our board always asks about that.
Right. What we decided yesterday for the health center, what I mentioned was significant 340B. We have decided that we're going to rerun the report and compare them to Ryan White grantees that happen to be FQHCs. So finding that relevant comparison may change the benchmark. Again, our recommendations come from, the whole subset of FQHCs across the country. And so that's why it's important to look at not just the median or my recommendation, but how that looks to you. And as a follow-up, anybody who's interested, if you're looking for like your state numbers or something along that line, I'm happy to share that. And so even state specific, right, whether or not your Medicaid expansion or not, some of these ratios will vary. And so it's great to know what's in that calculation. One organization we worked with, their personnel costs were 82 and 83% per year. And when I was like, how do you sustain that? We found out that their auditors included every contract and lease in operating staff expenses. So in their professional contracts was their equipment lease, their garbage, every known contract they had signed was in that. So it was misrepresenting what their staff cost was. Did I do a little bit better with that? Okay, great. Okay,
you got one more question that's come in. How many health centers did you say were in the high performance group? Brett wants to know.
Yeah, I think it was 313. It tends to be right above 300 per year. So I actually ran that out of curiosity the other day. And it was like 315, 303, and then 316 or something like that for the last 4 years. So it's pretty consistent. Now, there are health centers that jump in and out of that group, but it's relatively stable to about 300, which is oddly enough, right? We could do a statistic analysis on why it seems that a quarter of our health centers lose money every year and a quarter of them are high performing, but it's never the same ones year after year. So if anybody's looking for a PhD or something like that, I'll be happy to share the data.
Ronan, thank you, Jonathan. Ronan asks, what are the metrics for high-performing health centers?
Yeah, so I mentioned that you meet or exceed the financial benchmarks, right? So you have an operating margin of higher than 3. Your personnel costs are no more than 70% of operating revenue. You've got at least 60 days cash on hand, and your days in patient receivables are less than 45 days. So those are basically our 4 basic financial ratios. So if you're doing better than those recommendations, as well as being on HRSA's clinical leader or clinical, I'm having brain cramp, the clinical leaders. I know there are a couple of different designations. And so if you're identified as improving your UDS clinical outcomes by HRSA, again, that balance between finance, operations, and clinical outcomes. So if anybody's interested to know if they're on that list, I can tell you if you're on the list. I don't know if I can actually publicize that list. So. Another great question, though. Thank you. So when we look at days cash on hand, right, at the medians, and so this has been relatively consistent, 2017 through 2019. And I'm sure everyone on the phone today knows why we have that little hockey stick going up in 2020, right? A little thing called COVID and a little thing called COVID relief. Now, when we looked at some of our reports for 2020, we noticed that it depends on your fiscal year end on when your COVID relief funds would be reported or would come out, right? So we know UDS is a calendar year, but fiscal year changes. And so some organizations reported their COVID relief funding happened in fiscal year 20. Others, it's going to be fiscal year 21. And so we expect to see some outliers, if you will, continue for at least another year. And so we are looking for 2022 to be a little bit more, I guess, back to baselines or consistent. Hopefully we're moving our way out of COVID. So, but this is something that we wouldn't share publicly. That I've worked with a lot of health centers that said 2020 was the best financial year that their organization may ever see. And we know that's temporary and just the way that we account for some of our funding. And over the next 2 to 3 years, you'll be spending a lot of that funding. So again, knowing where you are and knowing what the numbers are behind the calculations. So I think we're going to switch gears just a little bit. So I took just a couple of snapshots. There we go. A couple of snapshots of some other metrics, right? And again, this is kind of building, this is information you have on hand to where we get to the scenarios. So these are some key productivity metrics. The actual full PEP is like 27 pages long. So please don't think that these 4 or 5 rows represent your organization. There's a lot of information in there on both patients and visits and things of that nature. But if you look at medical patients per medical staff FTE, coming again directly from your UDS, 296, 291, 289, very consistent. A little bit of decline in 2020, and we saw this decline across the board. Again, operations being interrupted and impact during the service, COVID, telehealth. There's a lot of things that kind of tell this story. And then you look at the comparisons, 259 and 260. Even looking at the comparisons, if we had 4-year trends for all 3 groups, you would see, a slight decline. And, 296 to 289 is not a tremendous decline, but, we've all seen productivity kind of, fall over several years. After doing this for 20 years, I remember for a while it was EMR. And then we said, oh, it's, at mid-levels, if you will. And then it was COVID, and then it was the reporting and administration. And so we've seen this, and, I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where productivity on its own, the way we currently count it, improves. So it's really about efficiency with the care team. And so this is why, you can look at our productivity by provider type as well as provider team. Dental patients, as you might imagine, 719, 720, 706, and then 601. Again, significant decline simply because dental services were shut down. Dentists were either, I have worked with health centers where their dental staff was let go simply because they didn't have the cash on hand to continue paying them or reassigning them. So again, when we talk about, why we look at some of these financial metrics, there is, a method to the madness. Mental health patients, you can see there, pretty consistent, and then substance abuse. Now, in some organizations, we saw mental health and substance abuse skyrocket as far as productivity from 19 to 20, not only taking on additional providers, but the need was exaggerated, as well as being able to bring on additional staff. So again, a lot of different stories behind these numbers, just giving a little context for when we start plugging these in to scenarios.
Jonathan, there's a
Yes.
couple of questions
Sure.
in the chat, if you don't mind
Sure.
here. Wanted to ask, can you give more context? Is this 296 patients per year per FTE?
The 2017 number, this comes from the national UDS, right? How many medical patients and how many total medical staff, that's providers and support staff, that you have listed under the medical category.
And in what time period? It's Rachel. Is it?
It's a calendar year. It's from UDS, so it's
But that
2017.
doesn't make sense because the patient panels for each provider are in the 900s to thousands.
This is not per provider. This is medical staff. So these are non-billable support staff as well. So when you start comparing this number, different organizations range anywhere between less than 1 to 3 support staff per provider.
Gotcha.
So again, that's a great catch though. Yep, that's a great catch. And we do have patient panels in the full report. So again, it really depends on what type of question or what type of decision you're facing and what's the best driver here.
But
Thanks
also, Jonathan, at the substance use disorder patients per substance use disorder provider, there's a cap on them. They can only have with a data waiver 30. So how could one provider even have 120 patients? It's not possible legally.
Well, this is how many patients they saw in a year. So
They have
I'm
a
not sure
panel
I'm
that has-
understanding the question.
So if you're doing like medicated assisted treatment, you have a cap on your data waiver of how many patients can be in your panel, and it's 30.
So that doesn't change over a year's time?
No, that cap, I guess how I would look at it maybe is you have 30 and then maybe some are discharged and then you have more, because this is pulling just from UDS data saying how many patients were served by that organization and those providers. So it's not looking at just a month period, it was looking at the whole 12 months. So they could have patients come in, drop off type of situation.
That's still really high, but okay. I mean, that means that you're not really keeping that many patients.
Perfect. If that was the question, and again, what we do from a distance, right? When we look at these reports, it just like you're looking at like, well, that's a little odd. Why is that number like that? So when we review this with individual health centers or even, with a state, we'll have a list of questions saying, here are the things that kind of raise the flag. What's the story behind it? And also, I almost always get asked, can you give us a list of the calculations for these? Yes, absolutely. We can do that as well.
And I'm not sure if this answers Jen Beckius's question. Is this panel size? Does that answer your question, Jen?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and say that I would not define this as a panel size because this is care teams typically.
Oh, I got it. You use different words, so I understand when you want more than one. It's not a provider FTE, it's the department FTE, basically.
And full disclosure, I don't have a clinical bone in my body. So if I use the wrong terminology, please feel free to correct me.
And let's see, I think Steve offered some clarification around the conversation around substance use disorder. He said it's not just medication assistant treatment either. And then Ed asked, is this patients per month or what?
It's for a full year, right? Just unique patients per year. So,
right. Thank you. All right,
great.
You grabbed some interest there for sure.
Yeah, I love this. This is great. Yeah, I love this. And I wasn't kidding when I said, I had the opportunity. This is one of my favorite groups, right? So keep it bringing it on. And so, again, talking to the CFOs and CEOs, I want to clarify that I never want to reduce our patients to profit margins, right? But looking at the data, operating revenue and expense per patient and per patient visit, right? So, this is important kind of looking at, looking at the organization as a whole, just the way it's worded. Operating revenue, you can see there in 2020 at the median, 1169, the operating expense per patient, 1115. So you're looking at, about a 40 to $50 margin, if you will, per patient. And then for the visit, it's a little bit lower, as you would imagine. But as long, and again, this is a state-specific issue a lot of times, right? Whether or not, you have any value-based incentives, if you're capitating any patients, still paid solely on, fee-for-service or PPS rates, things of that nature. So again, making this your own is important. But when you start looking at this and start looking at $330 grant dollars per uninsured patient and comparing that to operating costs and things of that nature, this kind of gives you a sense of, your grant, reliance on your grants, other types of revenue, looking at how fast costs are accelerating versus revenues, things of that nature. So again, it's just kind of initial. This is what we see from a distance. Oh, and I had the squares drawn that I overlooked. There we go. And so this is just, like I said, I just wanted to introduce the PEP concept, right? And then there's all that other healthcare data, right? You've got your own KPIs, you've got, HEDIS measures, you've got UDS, you've got the HIPSA, all these other acronyms, right? All have some sort of data metrics, productivity and measuring. And so looking at all this, the world itself is one big data problem. So how are we going to address the world, right? It's a little overwhelming if you take that big a bite. And so what I wanted to, just before we get to a little more Q&A was start looking at assumptions and scenarios, right? How do you use all of this data to make these initial decisions, right? So for those of you that might remember Econ 101, right, the bell curve, you've got very rare events or worst case scenarios on one end, and the best case scenario, which unfortunately are also very rare. What we're trying to identify is these likely cases, right? And because we have the most confidence that something will happen in between these parameters, right? Even when we do capital projects or operating or, all sorts of things, even within strategic planning, a lot of this approach is, well, how good can it be and how bad can it be? And we're going to manage somewhere in the middle. Are we willing to take some of these risks? Some organizations are high risk, high reward. Others are very risk averse. And again, that really drives the organization and how it approaches issues. And so I wanted to take a look at the back of the envelope on some of these scenario plannings. And these are, literally back of the envelope, not any rocket science here, I promise. This matrix right here, I'm a very visual person, and I know there's a couple of different matrices that are available out there. We were working with a health department of a state, and this is based on actual, right? They had $1 million that they had to invest in primary care development. And so their idea was, hey, we've got 13 counties that don't have an FQHC. Let's use that $1 million in those 13 counties. Well, we decided to, maybe $1 million stretch that thin isn't the best use of your funds. So as you can see on the left-hand side, we looked at the low-income population, which is the FQHC target market. And at the bottom, we looked at HPSA score, right? That kind of conveys not only population density, but population need and the lack of providers. And so if you look at the quadrants right here, you can see that, low income population, low HPSA in this bottom left, right? So these were very rural, not a lot of providers, but they did have some. This one county over here, very high HPSA score, but had the lowest population, right? So I want to say it was like 2,000 people in the county and no providers. Well, these three up here in the upper right, they had a high population and relatively high HPSA scores. And so it was decided that for that $1 million, they would focus on the communities in these three counties. Now, fortunately, within 3 to 4 years, 2 of those counties were awarded FQHCs. And then not too long ago, I want to say 2 years ago, one of these 2 was expansion site. They set up a satellite in the 3rd county. So it is a little bit of a success story looking backwards. But again, trying to determine where to best allocate your funds based on impact, not only for the organization, but impact for your communities as well. And this is an example that was actually predated COVID, right? And so I know immunization and vaccine rates, there's a lot of topics, a lot of discussion around this, but this came from a newspaper in Southern California, right? So the DDP vaccine, for those of you that do have some clinical bones, the typical vaccination for children, right? So what they did was they looked at like not being vaccinated results in about 5,320 cases per 100,000 children, right? So this is from the CDC as well. So each one of those hospitalization costs cost the healthcare system about $17,000. The DTaP vaccine is $80 per child. And within this service area that we were looking at was 74,000 children under the ages of 5. So all of this data readily available just at your fingertips. So the current immunization rate was 70%. So you assume the other 30% unvaccinated was costing the healthcare system $20 million in cost. So there was a foundation that invested $1.6 million, and they really wanted to get the immunization rate up to 80%. So they hired the staff, did some promotion, actually administered the vaccines and things of that nature. So after a year, this area's new immunization rate was 77%. So the 23% that went unvaccinated could theoretically cost the health centers or the health system $15 million in cost, right? So it's a reduction of $5 million in hospitalization based on a $1.6 million investment. So while they didn't reach the goal, it was successful. And again, just using data that was already available, putting together a program and implementing it and how you measure. And, certainly being able to calculate and convey the value. I don't know if anybody else has heard HRSA mention the word value in the last 5-6 years, but it does seem that we're all trying to convey how we're valuable to our communities. I know I saw Gerard smile a little bit. Even the INTACs, right? We're responsible for showing our value to you, the health centers, and then conveying that value to HRSA as well. So we've developed over the years several revenue modeling tools, right? We've looked at the impact of Medicaid eligibility, grant funding for uninsured, even based on specific financial or operational drivers, whether it's the PPS rate, reimbursement rates, expenses, et cetera. So I wanted to just take a series of screenshots to show you how some of this can get done. Now, before we look at this, I have had CFOs say, well, yeah, I could do that if I had the time. Well, that's the reason we did that, because we know you don't always have the time to do this little R&D projects. So what we've got here, the first one, is a Medicaid patient revenue modeling tool. So this came about, you might remember, in different days when they were really trying to reduce Medicaid eligibility across the country. This comes from a health center. Current Medicaid patients, 10,000. Current billable visits, 37,000. Their current Medicaid PPS rate was $150. And then there are these others, right? Medicare, other public, private insurance, other patient revenue, et cetera. Now, the driver here is this zero, right? If you put in a % increase or decrease in your Medicaid patients. And really, this was built around, there was a legislator that actually said on their state floor, you know, we should be paying the health centers the same as we pay private providers. And so we were asked to put together some scenario tools to see how much impact that would change if the change in Medicaid reimbursement would affect health centers. And so one of the Medicaid impacts that we do, and you can see here it's zero, so we haven't changed anything yet, that as far as their 330 funding for the uninsured patient, they were essentially breaking even, right? So that's important to know as well. Little circle there. And so this is, you know, what their income statement looks like. You can see here, 5.55 million in Medicaid revenue, very Medicaid dependent at 86%. And their operating surplus was at 15,000. So essentially break even, but it was positive. So if we go back to the driver page and we put in a negative 10%, and again, this is a very Medicaid reliant organization. If you just reduce the Medicaid patients by 10% and they went to the uninsured rolls, right? Then your change in annual revenue would be almost $500,000, right? So that would equate to this particular organization 25 days cash on hand over the period of a year, right? So when we start looking at some of those metrics earlier on, looking at the median, looking at internal benchmarks, this would matter. But also they would be running a $504,000 deficit for their uninsured care, right? So no longer is the 330 grant covering all of that care. It would actually not come up a little short. And so for the income statement, you'd be now looking at an operating deficit of 480,000 or an operating margin of negative 7%. So again, you know, it took us, you know, a couple of hours to put this together, took us 20 minutes to work through it. And I will tell you that when we showed this to the group of CFOs, the one CFO that shared his data with us cursed me, right? So I was like, well, I'm just the messenger. And really that's what scenario planning is for, right? It's easy. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It gives you an idea of the impact of certain decisions. And within 20 minutes, he went from cursing us to, hey, can I take this scenario tool and run it program by program, right? So if I am going to lose this much money, which program remains on its feet? Which program might I have to actually cut? And so it was a very productive process, but it also happened, you know, not in front of staff, not in front of legislators, things of that nature. So this is something that, you know, we could do in privacy, but it doesn't always have to be bad, right? What if we put a driver, we're going to increase Medicaid eligibility by 10%. And so now you're looking at over $500,000 in additional annual revenue, an increase of 28 days cash on hand, right? So if you were at 30 days cash on hand below the benchmark, now you're getting close to the national medians. But also, also you have a little extra 330 grant, right? And again, we know that, you know, the uninsured care varies from patient to patient, organization to organization. But for the sake of this example, now you've got a little 330 funding to help subsidize other services for those patients. And so if we look at the income statement, now you can see that Medicaid revenue jumped to over $6 million. And so the operating surplus is $569,000, sorry, or a positive of 7%. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to stop there, right? So you can see there that the operating expenses were $7 million. if you're going to start increasing patients, increasing services, we know that operating expenses are going to go up. So we tweaked the operating expense up 350,000. So now the operating surplus is 219,000. It comes out to that magical, oh, by such a coincidence, 3%, which is the recommended benchmark. And so you get an idea of just taking the information you have on hand, tweaking one or two numbers to find out how significant they are in your organization. So if we start looking at other scenarios, you've got scenario one here, right? So we want to see 2,000 new patients. And this actually came about from a board meeting that we were facilitating. And this was one of their strategic goals. We want to see more new patients without really thinking about, does it take additional staff, additional space, additional cost? And so looking at provider productivity, and again, you can run this by service line, by organization, by site, et cetera. So you'd need 4 new providers, right, to see those 2,000 patients. You've got a support staff ratio of 2.3. So now you're looking at a total of over 13 new FTE. And that's assuming that you were operating at full capacity before. Usually I get a CFO going, I can't afford 13. Well, that's what we're here to talk about. Estimated square footage per provider, right? There's another whole kind of art and science. Typically, it's anywhere between 1,100 and 1,800 square feet per provider, depending on the type of facility, the types of services. And so you're looking at 4,400 square feet. And you're like, I don't have space for my staff now, right? So what happens if you have to renovate or construct new space? So now you're looking at estimated construction costs, $792,000. Well, based on our experience, your hard costs tend to be about 70% of a project budget. The other 30% is usually split between soft costs like architectural and engineering and FF&E. So now you're looking at $1.1 million. So this is all came about, again, just looking at minimum and maximum, saying, hey, we want to see 2,000 new patients. So I like to line them up side by side, right? So if you took one and said, well, what about 5,000 new patients? And our productivity goes up. Well, now you're looking at still 23 providers. What if we need more space because we're providing multiple services? And so under the same sort of scenario guidelines, the project, you're going to need between 13 and 23 FTE or improved capacity and productivity. And it's going to cost you, if you need additional space, between 1.1 and 2.8 million. So rather than just start with a blank canvas, you can kind of tweak these numbers to make them your own, up, down, sideways, add columns, change the formulas, look at it for year over year and determine what year might be a break-even point. So another scenario might be, what if you've got 1.5 dental FTE, right? We've got this additional capacity. How do we fully utilize our staff? Well, looking at their productivity, 876 per FTE, that gives you about 13, 14 number of patients. Well, look at support staff. It's the same sort of process. Patient utilization, anticipated visits per year. You know what your reimbursement rate is. So there you go. Well, we've also run a report that looks at the direct cost per service visit, and it's higher than our reimbursement, right? So in this case, this scenario, and again, this isn't considering other revenue streams and maybe you've got a higher PPS rate, et cetera. So, but initially when you run these numbers, it's $107,000 loss. Well, what happens if you have to make a decision between scenario one and scenario two? And scenario two is we want to increase our mental health capacity, right? So, the productivity is very different for a dentist than it is mental health. But if you're looking at PPS, you're looking at direct cost per visit. And in fact, mental health cost actually was more than medical and dental the last couple of years. And so looking at this case, you're looking and trying to decide, well, this is an $83,000 loss. And again, I'm oversimplifying these types of numbers here, but it does give you a side-by-side comparison. And again, using data that, if I'm pulling it directly from UDS and an audit, you could probably pull it in real time and be able to build in different escalators over time. So if you know how much a project costs, we've got what we consider the debt capacity analysis as well. So, just looking at the structure here, what we do is we pull these numbers again from your audit, looking at change in net assets. You add back in depreciation, a non-cash expense. You add back in interest expense. And typically this is, if you're leasing or buying or building or paying for a building, And the new capital project is to replace that. You can add back in the interest expense on that mortgage, as well as add back in the rent that you were paying on the lease facility. So you can see here, we kind of plug these numbers in over time. 7% for 20 years, 6% for 20, and 6% for 30 years. So interest rates are a little bit lower right now. This was done a year or two ago. But you can see here over a 4-year trend, which lenders will do, your debt capacity ranges anywhere between 8.2 million and 15.2 million. Now, does that mean that I'm suggesting that you go out and borrow $15 million? Absolutely not, right? This is a min and a max. So if you have a project that's $6 million, I would first ask, do you have any other debt on your books to subtract from this figure? So if you're debt free, a $6 million project is very feasible. Now, if you came to me and said, well, our project is 12 million and we've got $4 million in long-term debt on the books, I would say we have to go back and find other ways to raise this money besides borrowing it. And so again, this is actually the link at the bottom of the slide actually goes to our website, and you can plug in your own numbers. And then again, if you really want just the open spreadsheet, you can just drop me a line and I'll share the whole thing, and it's unlocked and you can make it your own. But again, it kind of gives you an idea, if someone comes to you, well, we've got 2 projects and one's expected to cost this, the other one's expected to cost that. Sometimes you have to make that decision. And then I think the final scenario, I think it's the final scenario tool that we're looking at. What happens if you're looking at specific operating metrics, right? So right here, and you can see this is dated a little bit, 2015, but the operating margin, the personnel related expenses at 74%, the operating margin very near break even at 0.4%. But it also takes into consideration patients, productivity, operating revenue, and visits. Now, what happens if you wanted to increase your operating margin to 1.4%? Just say we want to go from 0.4 to 1.4. What would it take? Well, now you're looking at, you would need to reduce your personnel related expenses from 74% to 72. Maybe you increase your patients from 16,353 to 16,519. Or maybe you reduce the operating expense per visit for $3. So, having CFOs and CEOs on today's session, how many times have you or will you go to the CMO saying, I need your providers to see 2 more people per day? How well do you think that's going to go? Probably not all that great. I need you to do this in order for us. Now, if you sit down with a scenario tool and say, this is where we're at, this is where we need to be, I need 2 of these 4 things to happen. It's a very different conversation, right? And they understand that, and I was telling Gerard again before the session, we've conducted a similar learning collaborative as this, and we did Finance 101 for non-finance people, but we also did Clinical 101 for the finance folks. And so it was very, interesting to hear how the same information was perceived in 2 different ways. And so again, not trying to separate any of this data, any of these metrics entirely on their own. But again, it kind of gives you an idea to play with and saying, productivity's declined over the last 3 years. What if we were to improve it? What if we were to reduce the expenses per visit? What if that value-based contract changes our reimbursement, right? And so there is one other scenario. Sorry about that. I forgot I had added this value-based, right? So value-based reimbursement, most of the country is like between the trapeze artist, right? You see the other rung, but we haven't let go of the PPS yet, right? We want to make sure that we can make it across there. And so you can see here that the revenue transition period, the revenue mix, where we're theoretically moving more to a value-based reimbursement and less to a fee-for-service or PPS. And I know state by state, health center by health center, this is a very different conversation. But again, just for today's session, this was some research that a state asked us to do not too long ago, looking at, and this comes directly from the UDS, right? So I know not everything is reported in the UDS, but some of the things that I noticed in Medicaid managed care, the capitated charges are slightly increasing over the last couple of years. The thing is, you'll notice that there are about the same number of health centers year after year participating. And so if we were to look at this, it would be state specific. Another one that we looked at, Medicare, managed care capitated. is also growing in dollar amounts. But again, about the same number of health centers are participating year after year. If you look at Medicare fee-for-service, though, that managed care tends to be growing. Look at the number of charges, health centers that reported charges, 501, 531, 551. Those that actually receive payments, 498, 526, and 546. So this particular aspect of value-based reimbursement might be growing or is growing, or at least it's being reported as growing. And then finally, looking at private managed care, again, fee-for-service, 347, 355, 356. So not a lot of growth in the number of health centers participating, but significant growth, 2.1 million at the average, 2.4 million at the average, 2.7 million at the average. So there is some growth in these particular programs. So we're still on that trapeze. Some of us have let go a little bit more, and we might be free falling, trying to reach out for the next rung. Now, I will mention that the state who asked me to look at this, they had mixed experiences, right? They participated in some of these and not others. Not to call anybody out for any particular reason, but just it is. California tends to participate in all of these, whereas some states, I think it was like Kentucky, has almost none, right? So again, a very state by state kind of experience, but it's good to be aware and to have the access to some of this information. And so if we go back to that revenue modeling tool, you remember that same little scenario that we looked at earlier, we converted it to value-based reimbursement. And so right here, it's the same spreadsheet, the same numbers, that same 15,000 surplus. So what happens if someone comes to you with a value-based budget or incentives, right? So you've got the same number of Medicaid patients. They want to capitate the payment, right? Annual per Medicaid payment at $500. I know that's not much at all. You've got some incentives built in around PCMH, around some clinical outcomes, to where it's possible to share in those savings or incentives, pay for performance, whatever your definition or dialogue might be, of $150,000. And in an acknowledgement of the care management, they're also going to provide you $3.50 per member per month. So the total annual reimbursement adds up to 5.57, right? So if you plug this into the projected income statement, your operating surplus is $35,000. And you're like, well, hey, that's easy. Why is everybody talking about value-based care? This stuff's easy. Well, actual payments, right? You had your 10,000 Medicaid patients. You got your $500 capitated payment per patient. But guess what? The incentives, you only got PCMH level 1 that year. Your clinical outcomes, you only improved 2 rather than 4. So you only got 100,000 in incentives rather than 150. And because you couldn't find all of those patients, your per member per month ended up averaging $2.75. So now the Medicaid reimbursement drops. And so now you're looking at a negative $105,000 deficit for the year. And so if you start looking at that min and max, how good can it be, but also how bad could it be? This could have kind of been better negotiated, and certainly knowing the cost of your patients and visits would go into that. So as we wrap up, some of the takeaways, right? Remember to define the project or decision at hand. You don't need to look at every data metric or every bit of information for every decision. You want to identify the data that you already have on hand. Again, when Capital Link knocks on any health center's door, it's an addition to their day job. Having worked with health centers for this long, I never want to ask you to create a new data report or a new data metric. And then, develop some scenarios. Again, a lot of this is back of the envelope stuff. You may be doing a lot of this already. And if you've got some great ideas, then maybe we can collaborate on some of this. I'm happy to do so. A couple of states at the peak of COVID, we built some scenarios around looking at revenue for telehealth visits versus in-person visits, because their state was discussing the idea of tiered reimbursement. And so they wanted to know how good could it get, how tough could it get. So you want to use the data that you have on hand first. Again, looking at like a market assessment, the UDS Mapper is a tremendous tool. It may give you the first and initial 25% of the information you need for any geographical decision. Then you need to find out those elements that bring you to 50, 60, maybe even 70% of the information. And then identify those data elements that will enhance those calculations, right? Looking at those specific significant drivers. If you're looking at cost per patient, drill down, find out which one's most. We showed the personnel cost as far as an organizational expense, simply because we know that's the lion's share. There's some other significant costs, as you well know, within the organization, but perhaps not having the impact that staffing costs might have. So, it's not a sales pitch. Again, happy to answer any questions about Capital Link, but on our website, we've got a lot of webinars, a lot of toolkits, a lot of publications, a lot of collaborations with Gerard and NAC on there, like the strategic planning toolkit, right? It is quite a manual, but it does step-by-step for strategic planning and things along those lines. So I try to end with something to lighten the mood, right? Yeah, right. So nothing is more difficult and therefore more precious than to be able to decide. Napoleon Bonaparte, and we all know that he had quite a few major decisions in his life. On the other extreme, Homer Simpson, when in doubt, go with what you know, right? So hopefully we're finding our way in between the best case and worst case scenarios, and some of this was useful. All right, so I have talked quite a lot. So now I'm here to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. This is just greatly appreciate, tremendous. I note a couple of questions in the chat about how can they get access to the modeling tool and to the full report. So maybe we'll start with that question. Then we'll invite a couple of our mentors to offer some reflections before we open up for additional questions.
Sure. So for the reports, we do have some operational and financial trends for like the U.S. median and rural health centers formal publications on our website for free. If you're looking for something a little more specific, we do provide under our HRSA contract. We can run some of these dashboards and trends for your organization and compare them to your state or similar size organization. So as well as some of those Excel models you saw the screenshot, you can see that those are not necessarily what I call professional visualizations. So if you call or email me, I can provide them to you at no cost. I just can't say that publicly, right? We don't put a billboard up there. Come one, come all. But certainly through the cohort today, I'm happy to provide it.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Greatly appreciate it. Now we want to give an opportunity for two of our mentors today. Providing the CEO perspective is going to be Jamie Ulmer out of Harder, Florida Health Center, and he's going to be followed by Trista Besic out of Alluvian Health in Montana. So why don't we turn it over to Jamie. Jonathan, I think Jamie has a slide he's going to share with us. We'll give him an opportunity to do that.
Well, first and foremost, I want to say good afternoon and thank you very much, Jonathan, for that presentation. When I look at our financials, there's always a slide that gives key indicators to our board of directors. And those key indicators are directly from Capital Link's data points of how our health center is looking as itself, as well as across the nation compared to other health centers. And so I really appreciate that data because you cannot compare us to hospitals and other primary care centers. And so Capital Link's data points is really good for us to have a standard of measurements for ourselves, for FQHCs, and not comparing us with folks that don't really fit in our realm. But what I wanted to share based upon some of what Jonathan presented to our fellow CEOs and CFOs is that the one thing that really stands out to me is that you have to find the reports that fit you, that you can use, because there's so much data. As a healthcare organization, you could be ad nausea with data out there. And sometimes it can become overwhelming to what do you use, what don't I use, where do I use, that you may not be able to execute what you need to because you're so overwhelmed with data. The other thing about healthcare data, it is very complex, as you well know. Our data is unlike any other industry. If you think about manufacturing, you sell a screw, you get paid 20 cents for the screw. You can see the AP, it was only 1 or 2 days for you to get the money to receive that product. Healthcare is nothing like that. There's a huge lag time and you have to be very predictive. And so what I use as a CEO is I think about reports that allow me to turn this huge ship. Think about all this data in this huge organization that you have out in the middle of the ocean. and you need to turn it very quickly because either there's an iceberg or there's someone that's about to run into you. Well, as you all know, ships do not turn very fast. And so how do we as a healthcare organization turn our ship faster than what you normally can? And so what I use is two different opportunities. One is a report that I utilize that allows me to be able to see multiple things that's going on within our organization immediately and make an effective decision within that month that can change the difference of being black versus red in our financials. As you well know, your UDS is an annual report. Your financials are a month behind because you're reporting to your board of directors and your finance committee what happened 30 days ago. Your financials are also lagging about 45 days of when your insurance companies are paying you, and your audits are a year after. So you're receiving reports that are so far behind that sometimes you're waiting 30 to 60 days to make a decision. Sometimes that can be too long. So we created this report. I'm going to share it with you. I call it a productivity report, but what it does is it allows me to be able to turn the ship on a dime. And so it's real time, but it gives me data on the day before. And what I can see is productivity based upon where my providers are and how they're seeing patients. But it gives you other points of information that you may not think about. But our main location, as you can see here, has all these providers. Some of them are dentists, most of them are nurse practitioners and doctors. But these are providers who charge within our billing system. And so I can see the productivity. I can also see if, for example, the CMO made a decision to let all the pediatric providers off one day at the same time. Of course, there are going to be call outs. People do get sick. But when I do see something like that, I can say, hey, CMO, let's not close a clinic by you allowing all the providers off in one location. I can see this real time of what's happening as well as plan strategically. But I can see our residents' productivity. I can see all the way across the entire organization as I slide from one end to the other end with all 8 of our locations, how our providers did for that particular day. I can also do predictive analysis by looking in the far left column and seeing what our average is going to be for the month and kind of tell where we're sitting within what we predicted the entire year to look like. Now, say it's today, the 22nd, and I can see yesterday's information. But today, I can make a decision really quickly to change the dynamics of our productivity or what may actually make an impact on our financials by the end of the month. But if I wait until my financials are done, I am 15 days into next month before I can actually make that kind of decision. Another part of this report is daily collections. I can also see within this report, all of our sites, how much charges went out for that day, what the front desk collected in sliding fee scale dollars for that day. So on yesterday, they could have collected $1,625 in sliding fee scale dollars. They only collected 42%. Now, granted, our goal is above 50%, but the fact is I can have a small conversation today, heading into the end of the month, and make an impact before the end of the month. I can also see associated specifically to this month from March 1st to March 21st, where we stand in the amount of charges for that particular month. I know collections by insurance companies is probably going to be between 40 and 50%. If we're sitting at about $1.5 million in charges by the end of the month, we would have had a decent month. I know that I just made 2 payrolls in that month without having to make a drawdown. But these are decisions made within 15 to 30 days instead of waiting 30 days. This is one example of a report that we use that helps us to make these decisions. The final thing that I'd like to bring that we use is what's called a biweekly operations meeting. This meeting allows us to bring all the staff in from our directors, practice administrators, as well as our CMO, COO, and we can see some of the same data that I just reported about the middle of the month. Remember, a lot of these reports, you won't know what you're going to look like until the next month. I'm just offering a small little tidbit about what reports can do and all the data analysis can do to change the dynamics for what your ship is moving to in a very rapidly paced time. Again, using a very small amount of data that helps me specifically to run our organization, because Lord knows there is so much data that sometimes I just don't know which one to use. So I want to thank you for your time, and Gerard, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And some of your colleagues are asking in the chat if you could share the template with them. They'd love to have access to it, so we can maybe get that loaded into Nautopod for everyone to have access to.
Definitely, I'll try to get that loaded. It is rather difficult to make because you're building it out of your EMR, but we definitely can get something like that. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. And now we'll give our attention to Trista. Trista, are you on for us?
I am actually, and I've been watching that spreadsheet and loving it. So my name is Trista Bessich. I am currently the CEO for Illuvian Health in Great Falls, Montana, Central Montana. I was formerly the CFO. So anytime I get to see something like that links all that stuff together, it's totally my jam. And I'm like, oh, can I play with the template too? I don't know if I have been granted permission to pop something up on the screen. I actually am kind of coming at it from a different angle from Jamie. I love spreadsheets. I love those numbers. I love how all that comes together. And for me, that tells a lot of story, and it helps me explain whether I'm presenting an idea or whether we're talking about growing a site or talking productivity. That makes a lot of sense to me in that format. But one of the things that I have discovered in my life now is that is not everybody's kind of communication method. And so in terms of taking all of that data and really figuring out a way to transition the spreadsheets that I love to a way of telling the story that helps for the organization, we know that we're always lagging, and we know that there's more data than we know what to do with, or that most of our staff or community partners can digest in a way that makes sense to them. One of the things that we've really focused on doing in the last 2 years is taking the data that is a little bit more digestible and turning it in, creating a narrative around it. So yes, it lags. We're always going to be talking about what's happened and how do you utilize that to project forward, which is, Jamie's got a fantastic tool for that. And I love those kind of things. But there's a lot of value in being able to leverage your history and your data to tell a story about your organization. A couple of years ago, and this is one of my past ones, we implemented an annual report, which feels, just so everybody knows, we came out of a governmental model. So we were a co-applicant model. So it's got a little bit of a governmental feel to it, but this annual report has turned out to be one of our best ways of leveraging our data to communicate both internally and externally. So it helped us really build our story around who we are and what we do, but link it out to hard numbers. The really great part about this is it has also leveraged or strengthened our projections. So when we're talking to the board or financial institutions or community partners about projects that we want to do and how we want to leverage our whether it's our productivity or the infrastructure of our organization to grow programs and services, this has created a way for us to take that historical data that is typically overwhelming and turn it into a story that our internal staff or external staff, our external community partners can really take your data that makes so much sense in your head and on your spreadsheets and turn it into something that they also understand, or that becomes valuable to you in terms of communicating to maybe the chunk of your staff that doesn't love spreadsheets in the way that we all do. So one of the things that I really have appreciated and learned in the last couple of years is my passion for spreadsheets and being able to extract so much information just by looking at those numbers is not of value to, probably 60% of my team. And so by leveraging that historical data, by putting it into a way that's a little bit more digestible, we have created a more transitional communication method that allows that data to be useful, that allows the historical data to be useful for future projections. We've also discovered in the last couple of years, I'm going to stop sharing because it's not related to that anymore, that presentation. as we have really worked with our team to use data as a strategic set when we're looking at projecting or moving the organization, adding sites, adding services, we have it's a one pager essentially that allows any member of leadership to kind of put in their idea, and it's got the right prompts and built-ins so that if they're looking to project a new service line, we have built it in so that they can identify what the FTE is, and there's some calculations built into that so they can see what they're proposing as a potential cost to the organization. We've also built a little bit of our revenue-based information in there. So if they think it'll bring in 150 encounters, we've got some back-end stuff built in. So the calculation will pop up and it'll say, okay, so if you think we're going to see 150 new patients, and it's a medical line, and that equates to 4.2 encounters, here's what this kind of looks like based off of reimbursement. So they get that before they have to go in front of anybody, and they can kind of dig into what it looks like. If I really think this idea is valuable. I want to put in a new school-based site out in middle of nowhere because we got a few of those. And so they have that ability to kind of start to look at it before they get in front of people. And it gives them an opportunity to dig in from their perspective, where maybe spreadsheets aren't their jam. And so it doesn't look and feel like a spreadsheet, but it creates that opportunity for them to learn the data up front. The other nice part of that is, in terms of data collection, we've built into that one pager this request for them to identify from the very beginning, how do we know if this is successful? How would you measure success? And so it creates an opportunity for them to identify early data points based off of our experience with other projects or programs, whether it's QI, QA data, whether it's productivity numbers, or it's new patient volumes, or revenue, whatever it is. It creates an opportunity on the front end for them to have to put in a little bit of time and identify, how are we going to measure this? How are we going to determine if this is productive or viable? How does this impact our strategic plan? And so by incorporating that at varying levels and varying degrees, we have taken what is historic data and leveraged it to become a tool for active conversation and development now, but also for buy-in to projected, services or growth or sites, that kind of stuff. But knowing that, as much as I love the spreadsheets, I have a whole bunch of people in my organization that don't, and it doesn't make sense to them. So trying to convert those to a tool by telling the story that is of value to them and actually kind of connects them to the data in a way that is much more digestible and relatable for them.
Thank you very much, Trista. And you're getting some requests for sharing in the chat as well. So
yeah, I'll kick out that one pager. Yeah, it's great.
Thank you very much. It's clear that this topic of data is one that has touched a chord for the cohort overall, our mentors, and everyone. So I'm glad that we've been able to have this discussion today. So now we want to see if you've heard from Jonathan, and you've heard some reactions from our mentors. Are there questions that you have for Jonathan? So the floor is open. If you have any questions, feel free to either raise your hand and share your question, or if you have any question, feel free to post in the chat as well. Any particular questions that you may have for Jonathan?
Gerard, I had a quick question for Jonathan. I was curious if there are, I know you listed out the high performance metrics, and that's how they, and I think that's how Capital Link is defining what's a high performance or HRSA. So I'm wondering, are those the kind of key benchmarks? Are there any other ones that you feel that we should be looking at and would be key as we're, looking at sort of a endemic as we move into, shifting out of COVID dollars. And so just wondering if you have some recommendations.
Well, it's kind of like, Jamie just mentioned about a lot of our data, because it is kind of national and standardized, lags behind. So I was just talking to a health center now. I was like, oh, I can't wait to see the 2021 UDS report, right? I can get it on an individual level from the health centers, but not these. I can't track the trend. as real as I guess as current or relevant or recent as I'd want to. But as far as other comparisons, like I said, financially speaking, we all understand a lot of those financial metrics, right? The operating margin and things of that nature. And you track that on a regular basis. When you compare that to high performers, again, understanding what a high performer is important, right? They've met and exceeded our benchmarks as far as our recommendations. And a lot of those other metrics and productivity figures, there is no target or recommendation. Again, it's more important to know where you've been and where you want to go, and how easily is that obtained. It's almost like mini strategic planning, right? This is the goal we want to set. And in fact, some organizations use some of these KPI reports in setting. This is, we haven't hit 3% operating margin, so we haven't been able to accumulate revenue. So we haven't been able to take on that new site or implement that new service. And so working backwards from a strategic goal, these are the things that we need to address. So then finding those relevant comparisons. I worked with a very small health center in California not too long ago, and they said, we want to be compared to health centers with less than 5,000 patients and less than 7 million in annual revenue. Well, we could do that, right? And so the trends were completely different for these size organizations and the number of services they provided, as well as the cost. They didn't necessarily have the economies of scale. So again, finding the relevant comparison and then finding what is obtainable for your organization. So did that begin to address it? Okay, all right. Before I ramble further on. Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Jonathan. Any additional questions for Jonathan?
This is Rachel Farrell. I was just gonna, hi Gerard. I was just gonna add, that might have been my health center that Jonathan was just referencing, but we just did some work with him. And it just really was so telling to look at the data that he and his team sent us, because our MO is like, oh, we have so much work, let's hire more staff. And we just keep hiring. And then when we got the information back from him as to how much support we had per provider, it was astounding. And I realized that it's, what's lacking is not, people, it is efficiency. And so I went back to the drawing board to see how I can, help people work to the highest level of their license, and also how we can put in some efficiencies working through OCHIN and other coaches and supports, rather than just hiring more and more staff. So that seems to be our tendency, but it's not necessarily a good solution.
And thank you so much for that feedback. And I wasn't peppering you for that, so I appreciate it.
No, that was great.
But to even further support your point, I was a co-presenter in a state last week, and the first half of the presentation was their state PEP. The second half of the presentation was from a workforce expert that said, okay, FTE means one thing because that's the way it's measured, but let's talk about capacity, productivity. So you're absolutely right. Just some of these things, it's just simply the way they're measured and reported across the board. And even in some of the scenario tools, when I say, oh, if you're going to see 2,000 more patients, you need to hire this many more providers. Well, that's only after you've determined they are working at full capacity. So you're absolutely right in looking at, some of the organizational structures and productivity approaches as well. And those aren't so easily measured. So
thank you very much, Jonathan. Any final questions for Jonathan? Any final questions for Jonathan before we go to our next steps for the cohort? Questions going once? Questions going twice? Questions sold. Thank you so much, Jonathan. We really appreciate the presentation, and we'll look forward to, I'm sure a number of folks will reach out to you directly, but we'll look forward to sharing any resources that you have for us with the cohort as well. Greatly appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Gerard, and thanks to everybody for your time today. Have a great afternoon.
You as well, Jonathan. Thank you.